So anyway, 5 years ago, they used it. He may have been able, I think he has. I don't know, he was sitting up on the dais. We have one planning is here, and we have a few folks from our office as well. Former, he was here, I haven't seen him. I saw him at a conference recently. The subsequent conference was like.
My name's Charles.
I'm sorry,
I did not see it. But then again, I got here late and just wandered around inside.
Do I have, we got him here?
You got the Roosevelt Island game.
Yeah.
Okay,
But I didn't get your email today. Maybe it went into my junk. But I heard from
Yeah,
emails.
I just have some, I have some, but I think I'll try to talk to you and get some people like, the one thing I really want to do is just do a brief introduction first, then we go into the reservation.
So we'll go around and
every title, and then
That's fine.
and if you guys can, if you have questions for each other, think about that, and then I'll try to leave some room, so you guys can ask each other questions.
I got your questions.
I think so, unless something takes us in a different way. Oh, no, that's the, yes, well, I'll answer those general questions.
Real estate
Or by
professional.
somebody who specializes in working.
Yeah. So as you're looking at our parking, it's right.
Oh, no, but I think we do have a lot. Is it just parking or is it, I thought you did a lot of traffic. Well, one of the things I want to do is, and I'm going to be changing that process, so we would really started at the very beginning of the show. And I'm going to be changing the environmental process, the sustainability, mitigation actions. Tying it to the mile. Obviously, resilience and sustainability issues. Are you familiar with someone that, or is that? Oh, yeah, we're working on projects with long range. But doesn't you guys feel like they can around with that?
That's it. Oh, you see? There we go. Showing some up this way.
I'm familiar with the downtown. Initiative. So, they're transporting and developing. So, there's challenges.
Are we ready to get started? Is everybody?
We're still doing Ron here.
What brought you by?
Barrett is. Oh, yeah. Sit. Sure.
Mine?
Sitting around, that's no problem.
Working in community development and what's going on in other regions. Outside of not from Long Island, so
My wife's got 2 boyfriends.
What about you?
I guess so. I would say I would definitely.
Hey, Ron, how you doing?
One to tell us.
Yeah, it's good. Hey, Josh, yeah. Some orange wood.
Terrorist. And then I followed it. I think he has to. Of course, I don't. Living the dream.
When you put on the spot.
No, I know. Okay. Kind of perfect time.
Well, it's just Oh, okay.
Instead of we were
Right. Oh, yeah, which is a little difficult because,
with the noise in the back.
exactly, the background noise.
But I mean,
Right.
and I did it like the other slide. That's in the living room and find TV. But I thought that was very good Hey Matt, how are you? Good.
Good to see you.
See you too. You didn't get on complete streets this time.
Yeah. They didn't want to hear from me after the last time.
How you doing, Jim?
Hi, how you doing, Jim?
No, they wanted you to speak on this one.
Well, I'll get banned from this one.
That's it.
Keep moving me around. You know, because we're a sponsor. Like to shove somebody in front of you.
That's it.
You know why?
Eric comes up to me and says, Denise said you'll speak. Okay, I guess.
Yeah, I saw that you were on, yeah. No. Years ago.
I went well, yeah, it was complete streets, so.
Yeah, I saw that.
And there was several people there that had nice things to say about state DOT, and I talked, so it was funny.
Yeah. You were surprised to hear people say nice things about us.
No, they really weren't.
Oh, okay. You're used to it.
But it was.
You can disown all of that.
I said I'm a recovering traffic engineer.
So I guess we'll go ahead and get started now. My name is Charles Lane. I am a reporter for WSHU, which is the National Public Radio Station here on Long Island, and I'm moderating. And if we could just very quickly go through and introduce ourselves and what we do, and then we'll get to longer presentation time.
Great. My name is Jamie Stover. I'm Vice President of Development at Mill Creek. Mill Creek is a national multifamily developer with a footprint sort of on the coasts and in the down in Texas, and we have a little presence in Denver. On Long Island, we've recently finished 2 projects, one in West Hempstead train station, another in the village of Hempstead on the north end of Main Street. And then we are under construction on Old Country Road in Mineola on another 275 apartments. Today I'll be talking about another project we have underway in Jersey City.
So I'm Steve Jacobs. I'm a Vice President at U3 Advisors. We're a small economic development and planning, real estate planning consultancy with offices in New York City and Philadelphia. And we work almost exclusively with universities and large nonprofit organizations on real estate strategy. And we were Cornell University's primary project management consultant for their Roosevelt Island campus from the very beginning.
I'm Meredith Bostwick. This is the Cornell table, by the way, Roosevelt Island table. Meredith Bostwick from Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, an architect and project planner and project manager. And we've had the honor to work with Cornell on envisioning what's possible at the Roosevelt Island, southern portions of Roosevelt Island, and also have worked with them on the master plan for their new campus, as well as the ultimate site development. So really seeing through in orchestrating and coordinating the site utilities, infrastructure, the campus microgrid that will power all of the buildings for phase one, the landscape, and really coordinating with each of the building teams to really make this possible in terms of a comprehensive site development.
I'm Matt Carmody with VHB. We're an engineering and planning environmental firm with 22 offices on the East Coast, about 1,000 employees. Our New York City office was involved in the Cornell project early on with the Economic Development Corporation in New York City, assisting with some transportation screening to select the site. So once the site was selected, we began working on the environmental impact statement and saw that through to completion. We completed the traffic and parking studies for the EIS. And since then, one of the developers, Forest City Radnor Corporation, came back to us and we had them, we got involved again to help them fine-tune some of the parking issues that they had in defining the amount of parking that they would need for one of their buildings.
Ron, if you want to just briefly, and you can actually go right into your presentation if you have one.
Oh, yeah, I do, but I have to ask Chris to track my presentation down.
Well, just briefly while
Yeah,
you do that,
I'll
Chris.
So my name is Ron Stein. I'm, I guess, the ex-president of Vision Long Island. I founded the organization, and I'm really, I'm happy to be on this side of the panel. I'm usually out there looking at other people. Vision was founded under one of the premises of trying not to reinvent wheels. We were very, very good early on in looking around the region, around the country, around the world actually, to try to find other examples of successes that we could apply here. And I have now been in a situation, having two teenage sons, both of whom are now in college, had an opportunity to personally revisit some of the issues, particularly the brain drain issues. And one of the places I have taken with great interest is Brooklyn. And that's where I'm going to focus my presentation. Lower right-hand corner, I think, is what Alyssa said. Yes, that looks like it.
Can everybody see okay, or should the light be on? Okay.
Fine. Say okay. There we go. Okay. All right. So a couple of disclaimers. One, I am not a marketing professional. I am not a real estate professional. I am perhaps at best a gadfly, but I am really trying to focus in on some of these issues that I've been grappling with this organization, actually for 10 or 15 years before the organization started, as early as 1990, and how it is we're going to deal with the issues. Now, we all know, and we've heard this all day today, that we're dealing with the brain drain. We are also dealing with the other side of that, which is the job drain. And we know that our economic imperative is to retain and attract some of the talented, best and brightest folks, and certainly our kids who want to give them an opportunity. But the other side of that doesn't get spoken to, the and part, so that we can continue to be able to sustain the essential services for the other folks who are not children, the elderly, who ironically are precisely those folks in mass, and I'm making a lot of generalizations today, don't shoot me, are the folks that are opposing young people coming back here with some of their ideas and their votes, etc. And it's one of the weaknesses that we have. Well, what we do know is that we are in crisis, that we are spending a fortune of money, giving our kids some of the highest quality educational opportunities, and we're noticing that they're not coming back. And they're not coming back for a number of reasons that we've spoken about today. And we're finding that it is very, very difficult to compete for the talented folks. And we're getting older. Brooklyn, on the other hand, has become the center of the galaxy. Everybody wants to be in Brooklyn. I bump into people who are from Berlin that want to be in Brooklyn. People in San Francisco are moving back to Brooklyn. It is incredible what is going on in this borough. And we need to understand Why? We need to try to figure out what's going on there. Why is it that Brooklyn is the fastest growing borough in New York? Why is it that they added over 82,000 residents in 3 years when everybody else is standing still? So if we can identify some of those aspects of Brooklyn, see what's appropriate to here on Long Island, because we are Long Island, we are not Oakland. What are some of the development projects that are fueling the success and the virtuous cycle that takes place, and what are the opportunities and what can we do here? And there is an opportunity, there's a niche here that I think we can take advantage of. So, why does Brooklyn rock? Why is it so hip? Well, first of all, we all know it has a tremendous diversity of arts and bars and venues. There's always something to do. There's a mystery around every corner. It also has wonderful transportation. It is also extraordinarily walkable. But what it also has, a tremendous number of social touches. You can open up your door on any street in Brooklyn and find hundreds of people your age, look just like you, or are very different than you, but with whom you want to interact. And that is something that young adults need. They crave social interactions, not with their parents. But it has also fostered something remarkable. Over 12,000 jobs have formed in the technological center, this tech triangle alone, in the last couple of years. There are 12 colleges there, and you have a wonderful, warm neighborhood feel. Brooklyn is an exciting place to be. Ask any of your teenage children, any of your grown kids, is Long Island exciting? And what we're seeing, though, is that in Brooklyn there's this massive amount of economic development that's happening. Residential, commercial, industrial, and a number of areas I'm just going to touch on very, very briefly today. There are people that are sitting on this panel who probably know a lot more about some of these individual projects than I do. But the Brooklyn Naval Yards, everybody here familiar with the Brooklyn Naval Yards, at one point in time employed 70,000 people who were working there every day. It was the center of economic activity in Brooklyn. What has happened through a massive redevelopment effort, over $2 billion and 10,000 jobs have been added. That's not per year, that's not correct. But it's totally sustainable. Sustainable development. They're looking at 2 million square feet of completely sustainable development. That means triple bottom line, profits, people, planet. That thing that we on Long Island have been striving for. And there are hundreds of businesses, and they cover the gamut. They cover the gamut from Steiner facilities, one of the largest production facilities, music and MTV production facilities, and just an amazing variety of businesses, from technology businesses to recycled countertop businesses to speaker manufacturers. Little mom and pops are going there. And what's happening around it, of course, Sweet and Low, which used to be there ages ago, has been the source of a fair amount of NPR programming, I would say, of late. But Sweet and Low is back there in their original building. What is remarkable about this place is that it's a beautiful marriage of old and new. I mean, you see this wonderful old gate, but then you see this wonderful technology. But this is part of what's called the Tech Triangle. And the Tech Triangle, the center of it is this area called Dumbo. Anybody familiar with Dumbo? Which I found out just recently means down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass. And Dumbo is a remarkable place because it's not what we would consider a classic downtown. It defies our downtown models. But it's home to a massive amount of residential development and a tremendous number of incubators, and it's providing a tremendous amount of space for young startups at very low square foot costs. Oh no, what did you do here? All right, so here's a picture. Here's the view of Dumbo, and these are the buildings, and there's the Manhattan Bridge. And you look the other way, and there's the Brooklyn Bridge. And what's amazing is you have all these beautiful open spaces. You have a massive amount of residential development taking place. Art is happening around every corner, mysteriously. You turn a corner and there's something interesting new. And it's all happening utilizing these large industrial buildings, most of which are standing. Now, we're all familiar with Barclays Center and the Atlantic Yards. Well, not just the Nets are there, but what we're going to see is a total of about a $5 billion investment in this area that ultimately is going to result in these, I wonder why this does this. Which ultimately is going to result in this massive office development. I should ask for a different pointer. Okay, so, and it links very beautifully with Brooklyn Academy of Music. It's a whole anchor to Flatbush Avenue for those people who know Brooklyn. And the amount of jobs and revenue this is bringing to the city is several $100 million projected very shortly. But the other thing that's amazing about Brooklyn is its wonderful quality of neighborhoods. Every distinct, interesting neighborhood, from Park Slope to Cobble Hill, to Borum Hill, to Fort Greene, which is actually very close to Barclays. And of course, the epicenter is Williamsburg, which is really hipster. And it's so hip that a lot of artists are actually saying, I don't want to live here anymore, just, you know, once the hipsters move in, we're done. But you can see it has a lot of the same qualities that a lot of our downtowns have. Beautiful streets, very, very narrow streets, very good, you get a real sense of public space and enclosure, and then you've got these great places like the Knitting Factory. I'm sure some of us are old enough to remember the Knitting Factory. But here's the amazing thing. People are leaving Brooklyn. They're leaving Brooklyn. 80,000 people are coming in, but people are leaving. And this article in the New York Times last year by Alex Williams was very interesting. And the idea is that hipstermia is actually happening. What's happening is that these younger people who are now having families, want to raise kids, suddenly realize $2,250 a month rent splitting amongst 3 other apartment mates wasn't such a big deal. But when you got to pack a family in there and you're carrying the cost by yourself, suddenly it's becoming a big deal. So what's happening is that these folks are leaving and they want to take Brooklyn with them. They want to take Brooklyn with them. So, the reasons they're leaving: housing has become too expensive, the schools in New York City are variable, life is hectic, there's not as much open space, and the talented, educated hipsters want to have their kids more in contact with nature. And that's what represents a great opportunity for Long Island. It's not easy to get our kids to come back to Long Island right after college. They don't want us to come back home so fast. They want to explore, and they're going to Brooklyn, they're going to parts of Manhattan, they're going to other places. But if we're going to get them back, we need to figure out how. The problem is they're not coming here. They're going to other places, but not Long Island. They're going up to the lower Hudson Valley. They're going even up to the upper Hudson Valley. They're going to New Jersey. They're going to towns like Tarrytown, Croton-on-Hudson, Dobbs Ferry. Frankly, have very little over the good downtowns of Long Island. But they're going there because it's a little less expensive, and because there's an easy commute to the downtown, and because there's something a little messy about most of these places. So what's happening is we're losing what I say the battle of the brands. That we have a lack of housing, and we know that. We have difficult transportation options, very long commutes from some places on Long Island to the city or to Brooklyn. We have a lack of diversity. That's a real problem for hip kids. They don't like to look around and just see people that look exactly like themselves. It's not interesting to them. And our downtowns, they say, are not vibrant, they're too sedate, they're boring, and all this results in a smaller, less talented workforce that we ultimately have here on Long Island. So what can we do? First of all, we have to press on with these smart growth themes. We have to build housing units. We have to build around transit areas. We have to improve transportation, the Long Island Railroad, all the stuff we've been talking about, all the things Vision's been about for 15 years. But we can focus on the things that we can do right now. And one of those is emphasizing some of the strengths and do the things that we're doing well, but do them more. So the focus on downtowns is a terrific opportunity. We just have to do it better. We don't have to worry about making some so picturesque and charming. We can start making them a little messier. But the thing we need to do is get the young people involved in what they want their downtowns to be like. If only old people are running the planning departments and only old people are weighing in at the zoning boards, you're basically going to get a framework that fits that mindset. I know my kids, when I talk about how wonderful Huntington is, my kids look at me like I'm nuts. I said, what is beautiful? It's got beautiful architecture, it's got beautiful streets, it's walkable. It's boring, Dad, there's no place to go. What do you mean there's no places to go? You got restaurants, you have all these, you got the Paramount. Dad, I got ice cream parlors, I got 3 pizza shops, and I have a Starbucks. There's no public space. There's no opportunity for them to talk, either indoors or outdoors. There's no opportunity for them to skateboard. We threw them out if they were skateboarding. And all these things are problems. And the other thing is that the industrial spaces, all the stuff that we always consider are on the B streets, the ugly stuff, those are opportunities because we see in Dumbo that those are the places that are cool and interesting. And those vacant spaces are spaces that are terrific opportunities for us to use. One thing we have on Long Island is a great asset, and those are our arts. We have a tremendous, tremendous amount of art that is native to Long Island. We have a tremendous reputation and history of generating the best musicians in the world. We are terrific. The problem is, ask a musician, no place to play. Can't play. I have to go to Brooklyn. We have to stop that. All these vacant spaces are terrific opportunities. So let's get creative. Let's start really pursuing the arts, and let's start making that really interesting to young people. But we have to do more than that. We have to get people to know what's going on. We have to create this brand. Because right now, the Long Island brand is not cutting it. We have a Huntington brand that's getting popular. Now we're getting a Patchogue brand, we have a Babylon brand, but it's not getting past us. It's not getting past Long Island. So how do we do that? First of all, we have to start selling the brand earlier. We have to get our young kids, the middle schoolers and the high schoolers, into the downtowns, and we have to make it relevant to them. We have to make it fun to them. We have to figure out what it is that they're going to enjoy doing on the downtowns. Okay, so we're pre-selling. I'm sounding like a car salesman. So we have to do the pre-sale. So when the kids leave, they go to college, they head off to college with a strong sense of community and a strong sense of connection to the downtown. I grew up in Dix Hills. There was no there then. And so when I left, people asked me where I was from. I said, well, I'm from Long Island. Kids that I knew that grew up in Huntington, I'm from Huntington. There was some sense of connection. And there were ways to connect with kids. I'm just walking down Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg. Here was one cafe that had Star Trek Sunday. How cool. You get a lot of baby boomers coming to that too. But how cool is that? With mulled cider. You have a music venue, the Grand Victory, that has all ages with various different bands. One hardcore, one Empty Vessels. All ages are welcome. You can actually go to a bar-type environment, listen to music with kids and other young adults. They have a bowling alley right in there, skateboarding, lots of bicycling, all the things that young people are going to want to bring back with them with their families when they come out here. So we know that we also have to deal with these existing mature downtowns. And I've given you a bunch of ideas, and there are so many others, and so many of the folks here that are doing downtown redevelopment truly understand these concepts. But what's good about the stuff that young people have is that older people like me really want to be part of it, right? We want to be in hip places. We don't want to be hanging around with really old people. We want to be in walkable environments. We've been talking about that all day. John Massengale has been talking about it as long as I've known him. That's the interesting thing. There's actually an intersection. Because we love the arts. We love rock and roll as much as the kids do. I want you to know something. I've actually started listening to hip hop. I never thought I could do that because my kids are making me do it. But it's fine. But we need to do something while we're doing all this. We need to get the family conversation going. We have to continue to poke away at this issue that school children are bad, that they're evil. Because that is what's preventing so much good development from taking place. We have to change that mindset. I think we're starting to make some headway, but we haven't been very good at marketing that. So, what I'm suggesting in sum here, we have to do some serious market research. We have to figure out how we're going to create our brand. We're going to have to really create the brand in our downtowns. We're going to have to make ourselves more hip, and then we have to begin to market the brand. We have to market the brand to kids when they're in school. We have to market the brand to Brooklynites, the folks who are in their 20s and early 30s, and start letting them know that Huntington exists, that Babylon exists, that Hicksville exists, that Mineola exists. We haven't been doing that. They don't even know about us. We've got to get on their radar. And we can even also do some marketing to the colleges that are right here. The other thing we can do, and I'm not going to talk about that now, is we can start pursuing strategic partnerships with Brooklyn. There are a lot of cultural arts connections that we can make. There are a lot of performances, arts and musicians that are going on in Brooklyn that we can bring here to Long Island. There can be a sistership partnership that goes on with these. There's economic development between various different businesses that can take place to build these linkages. So, the Brooklyn brand I'm suggesting to you can now be the Long Island brand. Hip, adaptable, eclectic, diverse, artistic, exciting, and that, I think, will help us get to economic success. Thank you.
Ron, I have a quick question. Earlier today, Eric made a comment, but I think it was interesting, that Long Island is a community of communities. I grew up in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is a community of communities. Yet somehow, each community seems to have been able to pull itself together. Fifth Avenue and downtown and Dumbo, and now what's happening across the river. How does Long Island relate to that kind of a growth pattern? And can we? Because we're still struggling with Patchogue does its Patchogue thing, and Huntington does its Huntington thing, and hopefully Hempstead will eventually do its Hempstead thing. But how do we put all of that together and make it one theme?
Well, it's going to be a little different theme for each municipality. Each municipality has to kind of stake out their identity. But when one looks at the arc of development in Brooklyn and in other communities, you see that there is a period where a community goes through enormous economic distress. Rents plummet, space suddenly becomes available, the artists start moving in because it suddenly gives them a place to work. Okay? That's key. The artist will precede the hipness of a community every single time. And so what ends up happening is that those communities, and it started with Park Slope 25 years ago. The artists came in, rents were dirt cheap. What happened? In less than 5 years' time, Park Slope suddenly became a major, major downtown. And all the hip people wanted to move there. And what's in Park Slope now? Nobody can afford to live in Park Slope. So people are now moving to Williamsburg. Same thing happened to Williamsburg over 15 or 20 years ago. And now it's moving. You look at Bushwick, for example, an area that was really in the pits. 10 years ago, you could see the artists are in there, you could see the streets, and you see it with all the murals that are on the walls, and you see it, all the little boutique shops that are opening here and there. So I think what has to happen is that communities on Long Island need to really pull up the arts. They need to find vacant spaces, they need the government to get behind it, they need to create the public-private partnerships to elevate the arts and elevate their sense of hipness. And then they have to do the other things. They have to provide the housing, and they have to let people know that this is happening. They're turning a corner. They're going to be new. Places like Farmingdale in 2 or 3 years, you watch. That's going to be a very, very hopping downtown.
So Jamie, tell us how hip Mill Creek is.
Do you guys want me to?
No, that's fine. Yeah, we should probably go together because we're talking about Cornell. So why don't you go and then we'll go.
Okay. I think actually my presentation ties in pretty well with, I'll just tee it up, I'll just introduce mine, ties in well to Brooklyn. I think, what I'm going to present is what Mill Creek is doing in Jersey City, which is a rehab of an old warehouse, right in the middle of, high-rises that have been built within the last 10, 15 years. And I think that there's a lot, I think the whole Brooklyn conversation is a really interesting one that maybe we can address a little bit later. But we did, in this building here that we are developing right now, it's actually currently under construction, we used a lot of the similar developments in Brooklyn as examples. Where's that? as examples for what we wanted to accomplish. So this is waterfront in Jersey City. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, looking at Lower Manhattan. Our property is right here, and it was a warehouse built in the early 1900s for it warehoused items for 5 and dimes, actually. So it's got large open floor plates, which I'll get to in a minute. And here you are, right in the middle of you know, Jersey City, which has just undergone a huge renaissance in the last couple of years. With this slide I'll show you in a minute, there's over 3,000 rental units under construction right now in Jersey City. So just to give you a little context, we're at that star. We have retail to the north. There's that's sort of you know, suburban style retail, but then a little bit over here you've got more authentic urban retail. 40,000 employees in the waterfront employment core, the path connection to Lower Manhattan, as well as the Hudson-Bergen light rail running north and south. This is the slide showing you a little bit more up close. We're a 5-minute walk to the Hudson-Bergen light rail to the east, another station, 6-minute walk to the north, and then a 6-minute walk approximately to the Grove Street Path Station. Again, here's the retail pockets, and then lots of residential around us that are, some of which is under construction now, most of which has been built out. Here's the property that we sourced. It looks like a jail. So you take a look at this and you say, well, what are we going to do with that? And again, I think Ron touched on, a lot of this is what was the stock that was in Brooklyn that's been turned around and made Brooklyn so successful. So it was a real challenge. We studied it long and hard. Here's another shot from the street. I mean, how you're going to turn that into rental apartments is a big challenge. Here's the interior. So lots of columns in precarious places. Didn't really necessarily lay out real well for apartments. But you know, here are the windows. I'll get to the windows in a second. But that's the condition of the property as we acquired it. Just some more shots. I'll go through this really quickly. Here are the windows. So this is a real challenge. 6 feet up off the ground is the windowsill. So that was a real challenge for us. Oops. But then we went in and we sandblasted. And what we found were these amazing beams that we thought, to Ron's point earlier about Brooklyn, was really authentic. And all around us in Jersey City were sort of these cookie-cutter high-rise apartments. But we think that the demographic that we're after really appreciates this sort of authentic Brooklyn feel, if you will. So we sandblasted it. We thought, oh, that looks great. We went ahead and closed on the property with some huge construction contingencies. Again, we still didn't know exactly what we were going to do with these windows. Here are the windows today under construction. We've knocked out approximately 2.5 to 3 feet below the windows to enlarge them. That's the way they were from the exterior of the building previously. And here's the inside. So you can see a lot more natural light, starting to feel a little bit more like a residence. Unfortunately, that's about all I have to show in terms of where we are in the construction, but here's sort of the typical floor plate. It lays out really nicely. We've got some very long one-bedroom floor plans, which are a little bit funky, but we think that you know, the demographic, again, that we're after will appreciate. They've got interior sort of loft-style bedrooms, and it laid out pretty well for all things considered. Luckily, it had these 2 courtyards, so we were able to double load the 3 sort of legs of the building, if you will. So it worked out pretty well in the end. And this is the first floor with lots of amenity space. It's actually in an arts district. So we're giving back a bunch of space here to artists, artist studios, and we're having a gallery here and here, basically free rent to the community. That's another rendering from the street. Again, we're going to reactivate the street life, and it's an exciting property for Mill Creek. So I look forward to the discussion.
Steve, are you all queued up? Or?
Yeah, actually, if you could just go back to the first slide that we had. And
I don't have slides, but I will use that to refer to it.
And Ron, I'm happy to say that I'm from San Francisco and I live in Brooklyn. I know I'm really young and hip, but I made that trajectory that you talked about. So, I'll wait till we just get the image up. Yeah, let's just use that first image. So I don't know how many people here know about the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island, by a show of hands. So this, whoops, did I lose it?
No.
Yep. So this was a result of the Bloomberg administration, I think building even on some of what Ron had said, recognizing, I'll just tell you in terms of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give an overview of the campus very briefly, and I'm going to focus on the sustainability initiatives and the environmental approvals and the mitigations, and then my co-panelists will talk about the site planning and transportation. But so the Bloomberg administration recognized that New York City actually, to attract this tech sector, was at a disadvantage compared to its major peers, which were the San Francisco Bay Area and Boston in terms of tech centers. And one of the reasons why it was is because New York City really does not have a top 20 applied sciences campus. And I know that Columbia, of which I'm an alum, might be offended by that, but Columbia is not really in the top 20, although it's getting much better. So the Bloomberg administration decided that it would have a competition where it would give free land in New York City, basically, to universities that could prove that they were going to build a world-class applied sciences campus in New York. And at the end, of course, it came down to Cornell and Stanford. Truth be told, Stanford did pull out at the 11th hour, and Cornell did win. But what Cornell is building here on the southern portion of Roosevelt Island, and this is a rendering, just south of the Queensboro Bridge, they have the Ed Koch Queensboro Bridge, is an interdisciplinary campus of Cornell University in Ithaca. Of course, Cornell also has a campus right across the river, their medical school. It's being built on the former site of Goldwater Hospital, which is being demolished as we speak, which was a New York City-owned hospital. It's conferring graduate degrees only. And conducting research, again, in the applied sciences. It was very important to the Bloomberg administration that there not be any health sciences here because it was felt that New York already has some world-class healthcare institutions. So the focus is on technology, innovation, engineering, computer science, and then commercialization, importantly, and the creation and retention of jobs in New York City. I mean, this is a major economic development initiative. I should also note that it's a partnership. Cornell partnered with the Technion, which is kind of the MIT of Israel. Cornell actually felt that the commercialization was kind of its weak point if it were to compare to Stanford or MIT in terms of the competition, whereas Technion has really driven a lot of commercialization in Israel. And so Cornell is partnering with the Technion, and the Cornell Technion Institute of Innovation is going to be housed on the campus. So I should note the campus is opening on Roosevelt Island in the summer of 2017. It's currently operating in the Google building in Chelsea. Google has given Cornell space. They're calling it Cornell Tech Beta, and they're operating in the Google building. When it opens in 2017, it's going to have 600 students in its first phase, and those are PhDs and masters only. And at full build in the 2030s, it'll have 2,500 students. So I should note that phase one, and I think that Meredith is going to talk more about it, but just to give you a quick overview, phase one is going to be about 600,000 square feet in 2017, an academic research building. It's going to have a residential tower, and I should note, and a commercial building that's commercial co-location for companies that are collaborating with Cornell. And I should note that Cornell is really, this is a university-private partnership in the sense that the residential building and the commercial co-location building are both being built by private developers on the land that's being ground leased by Cornell. So at full build out, it's going to be a little over 2 million square feet, and that's in 2037. In 2017, it's about 600,000 square feet. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Because I know there were some tweaks there in terms of what the original intentions were. So let's talk about what makes Cornell Tech unique. And I think the first thing is very apparent here in the sense that it's on this narrow, densely populated island in the middle of the East River between Manhattan and Queens. Roosevelt Island has about 12,000 people who are very active, if you want to talk about NIMBYism. There's vehicle access only from one point, and that's a bridge, a drawbridge from Queens. There's no vehicle access from Manhattan. There is a subway station, the F train, which is actually relatively recent. And then, of course, there's the tram, and that is the only way access. There's no ferry. The residents really would love to have a ferry on the island, and that was a big point that they wanted to make to Cornell. So I should note that Cornell, in planning this campus, took a real commitment to sustainability as just a basic guiding principle. A sustainable building approach. Cornell committed that the first building, the academic building, which is the building that they own, is going to be net zero. And that means that it's going to generate as much energy from renewable resources, and those are photovoltaic panels and other features, as it will use from non-renewable resources. So it's a net zero building. And I should note, and Meredith will talk about this more, just in terms of commitment to sustainability, its master plan has kind of an optimal building orientation in terms of capturing sunlight and maximizing the photovoltaic performances. And also efficient geothermal heating and cooling. Cornell is digging geothermal wells on the island. And then, of course, when you're building on an island, and Superstorm Sandy happened, right after the planning here, you have to think about resilience. And particularly now when we're saying that the 500-year flood level is kind of the new 100-year flood level. So in terms of master planning this campus, they're actually raising the elevation of the campus. And I don't know if you're going to talk about that a little bit, so I'll leave that to Meredith, not to steal her thunder. And then it's going to use the natural topography of the campus in terms of locating building entrances on the highest point of the island, and putting the mechanicals of the buildings higher up so that they don't get flooded like we saw after Superstorm Sandy. So as part of the land use and environmental approval process, I think Cornell also made some exceptional commitments. They're a bit unprecedented. And there's also, I think, when you talk about the approvals process here, you have to think of the kind of the unique context of Roosevelt Island. So the city is granting Cornell a 99-year nominal ground lease for that site. Roosevelt Island is technically owned by the city of New York, but it's leased to the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation, which is a creature of the state of New York. And I'll note that actually when the city is granting this to Cornell, the hospital, which is basically this area, the city did retain that from the lease because it's was owned by the Health and Hospitals Corporation. But then all the area around it is still part of the Roosevelt Island, let's call it REOC, the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation. It's part of their ground lease with the city, which goes until 2068. So this kind of added an additional layer of stakeholders and approvals. In terms of SECRA, the State Environmental Quality Review, the state actually did defer to the city because the city's standards are stricter than the state's. But both the state and the city were stakeholders here in terms of the approvals process. And I'll quickly go through what approvals processes Cornell had to go through. So even though Cornell won the competition and the city granted Cornell the 99-year lease, it was not entitled. The city had to, Cornell had to pursue rezoning of the site. The site was zoned residential. Cornell had to go through a zoning map amendment to change the site zoning to commercial. But Cornell also decided to create a whole new special zoning district that they called the Southern Roosevelt Island Special Zoning District. And Cornell developed the scope of this district and wrote the language describing what the zoning district would be. And in the language noted that the zoning district will have flexibility in architectural design to meet sustainability goals. It will commit to access to the waterfront and preserving view corridors, and also mixed use and walkability. And Matt will talk more, but in terms of promoting public transit, Cornell agreed to putting maximum parking caps on the island. I mean, it's hard enough to get to the island by car, but the residents, of course, were very worried, and Cornell said that, we are a transit-first campus, and we are going to agree to parking caps. And then, as part of the environmental approvals, Cornell explicitly committed to several sustainability measures. They committed to building on-site central energy plants. So there's going to be two. There's one, a 20,000 square foot one that's opening as part of phase one. And then a second one will open in the second phase, so that Cornell will be generating its own energy on campus. They've committed to photovoltaic panels on the roofs of buildings and integrated into the landscape. Like I said, the first academic building is going to be net zero. They committed to developing a system of up to 400 geothermal wells on the southern portion of Roosevelt Island, up to 500 feet deep for heat. And then strict energy targets for the campus buildings, including the net zero for the first academic building. Regarding the environmental impact statement, for those of you that know how an EIS works, you're looking at conditions and impacts of the campus, including traffic and hazardous materials and socioeconomic conditions and open space and historic and cultural resources, and then, of course, the construction impacts. And I'll note that actually, because we were tearing down a hospital that had a lot of employees and a lot of patients, we found that actually there weren't a lot of negative impacts of building a campus. The population was actually going to be the same, if not a little bit less in terms of the permanent population that will be associated with this campus even at full build. So a lot of the impacts were not adverse in terms of mitigation. However, there were a few that were. And I think Cornell agreed to some very creative mitigation measures. First, historic and cultural resources. Well, Cornell is tearing down a 1930s hospital that is actually has some architectural merit. Cornell did an alternatives analysis where they pretty thoroughly looked at if there were ways to preserve parts of the hospital. A lot of people in Roosevelt Island felt very strongly about that hospital. And Cornell determined that really there was no way to save the hospital and have a state-of-the-art technology campus. It just did not work in terms of what they wanted to do here and with their net zero commitments. So what they did do is that the hospital had 4 WPA murals of note. These were abstract murals. New York, during the WPA movement, these were the only abstract WPA murals that were painted in the country. Everything else was kind of social realist. I should say there were 4 WPA murals because we heard rumors that there were 4 WPA murals. There was only 1 mural that could be found in the hospital. The other 3 had been painted over 40 years ago in the 60s. But residents of Roosevelt Island, including the Roosevelt Island Historical Society, insisted that those 3 murals were still there. So we in Cornell hired art conservators to really look at almost every square foot of that hospital, thinking about where the murals might be.
Did you have to sandblast, or could you look through the paint?
No, they had to scrape the paint. There were ideas where they might be. We knew they would be in sunrooms. They knew that they would be in common areas where patients gathered. This hospital is 900,000 square feet. It is a huge hospital. It ran the whole length down to where almost the southern tip of the island. They found them. They found all 3 of them. And actually, there was a big article in the New York Times last week. So they found the 3 murals, and they're preserving them now. And those murals are going to be permanently installed in the new campus. So that was Cornell's mitigation for tearing down what was considered an architectural and historic resource on the island. The other adverse impacts were really related to construction. And I think the biggest issue for the island was truck traffic during construction, particularly because the island is only accessed by 1 drawbridge and only has 1 street that runs down its spine. And there was a lot of concern, what happens to that drawbridge? What happens if a truck does damage to the spiral road that comes off of that drawbridge? What happens when trucks are going down this narrow street? Because I should note, actually, that the street doesn't adhere to New York City zoning because Roosevelt Island is a creature of the state. The street is much more narrow than New York City zoning would allow it. So even though there's a lot of residential construction happening on Roosevelt Island and have been in the last 10 years, the residents of the island really wanted Cornell to commit to barging. Some residents barging 100% of the construction materials onto the island. Barging hadn't been used, I should say the Historical Society found photos of the construction of Goldwater Hospital where they were using barges. However, of course, that hospital was built before the bridge was built. There's no access actually from the Queensboro Bridge to the island. The Queensboro Bridge just goes right over the island. So Cornell, there was a lot of negotiation with the community, and Cornell has agreed to use two types of barging, harbor barging and roll-on, roll-off barging, that will decrease the truck trips by between 25% and 35%. And again, I will say this is a considerable expense for Cornell. They also have to construct a pier to accommodate the barging. There is no pier. A lot of residents on the island also wanted Cornell to commit to a passenger ferry service, which Cornell has not done. I will note that. And then finally, I think the other mitigation I want to talk about is that Cornell has agreed to replant all the trees. That was another big issue for the residents. And so all the trees that are being taken down from construction will be replanted, not necessarily in the same place, of course, but the southern part of the island will be reforested. So I think those are the major issues that I wanted to talk about, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Excellent. That was a brilliant framework. Thank you very much. All right, so let's, SOM has had the honor to work with Steve and Cornell for a very long time now, all the way from the RFP process with the city to really thinking through a diligent master plan. And I think from what Steve has just said, it just emphasizes the importance of all of the things that come before a building, right? In terms of strategy, in terms of development, approach, economic development with the city, and really thinking through before you ever get to that first building project. So, working through the master plan with Cornell, and then ultimately now, although we're designing one building for Cornell, which is the central utility plant. That's our token building.
It's an important building.
It's a very important building that will power the entire first phase campus. But we, as an architectural team, are working with Cornell to really mastermind all of the coordination that has to happen to make this phase one campus a reality. So it's a very different task, I think, for an architect in terms of just managing all of the different aspects of this campus from day one to finish. So Steve has gone through a lot of this. I'll just briefly touch upon that. But again, the initiative for the Applied Science Facility in New York City, this was obviously a Bloomberg initiative identifying an applied sciences and engineering campus, really excluding life sciences in that approach. So the competition basically put forward 12 plus acres, right, of New York City owned land. Basically the city offered 4 city-owned sites. One of those was Roosevelt Island, which I believe Cornell found attractive because on the other side of the river is, of course, where Cornell.
We should tell Ron another one of the sites was within the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
That's
but
correct.
Cornell didn't, there were problems with that site.
Right. So the one-year selection process started back in 2010. So that gives you a framework of when things really started off. Steve talked about some of the top institutions, including Stanford. And then New York EDC, obviously a big part of this was supporting green building and active design. So as Steve said, Cornell had to really invest in design intent for best practices when it comes to emergent technologies for a resilient campus. And I think a lot of that, especially in light of Roosevelt Island and also in light of what we're talking about here today with Long Island, I think that's why this project actually relates a lot to Long Island, is that a predominant amount of Roosevelt Island is actually below the floodplain. This is the 100 and the 500-year floodplain. So Cornell really had to think through from a master plan perspective, how are we going to plan this campus above the floodplain when a majority of the island is below it? So we were really helping them think through that. So some key decision points had to be made in a very tight time frame. Which site, how much development, what is the right mix of academic and other uses, which Stephen and his team was really helping with the pro forma of how this could really perform as a day one and an ultimate build campus. The schedule, how fast are we going to do that? And how can we really begin to plan within what we have to promise to the city? How are we going to pay for it? And who are our partners going to be, both from an academic and a financial perspective, long-term development, which Forest City, Radnor, and Hudson related are actually involved in the development of the Phase 1 campus now. So just from a start, you can see how many other team members have really been involved through this entire effort, from the RFP and ultimately to the site development. So we've listed a few of our consultant teams members there as well. So it's a project in process. As Steve mentioned, there's a temporary campus, the Beta campus, that's hosted by Google in their Chelsea headquarters. The first class of master students have started already, 2013. And they have major sector initiatives have already launched for entrepreneurs and residents. The vision for this campus is to create an open, collaborative community of entrepreneurs, network scientists, designers, and really the site really lends itself to that kind of openness, the river-to-river open collaborative campus. So since that time, we've closed on the land with the City of New York, which was last December. As Steve mentioned, we're demolishing now. The central utility plant is projected for start of construction in early April, May next year. So we're on the way. And the projection is to build up to 2.1 million square feet of program over 25 years. But really also, before we get to that full build, when we look at the Phase 1 campus, how are we going to create a sense of place in that first Phase 1 development? And then continue that sense of place over time and create open spaces that are going to take that. So just a few metrics: Phase 1 program, academic building up to 200,000 square feet, a corporate co-location building up to 100,000 square feet, a new executive education center with a conference up to 170,000 square feet, student, faculty, and apartments, and an open space requirements. You can see how that grows to the full build campus, and then similarly from a kind of complexion of the overall network of staff, faculty, students, and workers on campus, a total population of approximately 5,400 people over the course of 25 years. So here we are at Manhattan. I'll point out Dumbo, since that was talked about earlier today, and Roosevelt Island. The star is actually where we're looking at for the development of the campus. Show of hands, how many people have been to Roosevelt Island? How many people got there by tram? All right, there we go. So a lot has been mentioned about getting somewhere on to Roosevelt Island by car. But if you've ever seen the Superman movies, the tram.
I think it's Spider-Man.
Is it Spider-Man? Not Spider-Man movies.
Can't do superheroes right now.
Right, exactly. So the tram comes over next to the Queensboro Bridge, drops you off here, and so the major interpoint or entry piece to the campus will be along the northwest corridor. So just for bearings, most of the residential development is here, and at the very tip top of the island, the Metropolitan Hospital, Goldwater Hospital in 1939 is built here in yellow, which is currently under demolition. And as Steve noted, Cornell went through the process of really trying to understand, could we reuse portions of that facility? The hospital itself was struggling to see how they could reuse portions of that facility, because a hospital today, the way that it functions is very different than how a hospital would function in 1939. So very minimal, small, tight footprints, not to mention that the buildings are entirely ridden with asbestos, which is being mitigated as it's in demolition now. So back to the point, under the floodplain. So your first line here basically signifies the 100-year floodplain. And your 500-year floodplain, which is really the new floodplain that we should be designing for, creeps in even further than that. So you can see the edge of the esplanade of Roosevelt Island is actually underwater in terms of the 100-year floodplain. So when we talk about how we're going to service this campus, where in a kind of traditional model, you would build a kind of ring service of all of the infrastructure. That if you did that here, you would have to have submersible vaults for your transformers, right? And all of your infrastructure, which could really compromise some of the research that's happening on this campus. So our primary suggestion to Cornell Tech as a master plan is exploiting the ridge of the campus, being the highest above the sea level, as the spine that articulates how all of your buildings will be organized off of, how you access those buildings from a pedestrian point of view, but also how you service those buildings. So just from a cross-section point of view, you can see that our first line is the river esplanade, and above that you have the ridge at 19 feet as opposed to 11 feet. And then just for kicks, the height of the bridge. So if we look at this, your 19-foot kind of axis here, exploring the topography, thinking of how pedestrians will circulate, how they'll enter through the campus, and then how the campus then connects back to the island beyond. Thinking about the ridge, again, the tram drops you off here as the entry point of campus, and how that entry point could then take you onto the ridge and then spit you back out to the memorial that's all the way, the FDR memorial that's all the way at the end of the campus, and then connecting back, thinking of a secondary circulation network that organizes that pedestrian traffic, but also thinking of what are the primary parcels of development that would then be articulated off of that axis, and then from those parcels of development and open spaces that carry back into and connect into the ridge, creating those river-to-river views and opening the campus so that you can really benefit from those views. And also then thinking of nodes or green links that begin to articulate how this ridge is developed. And so we're working with field operations, James Corner Field Operations, to really have a grand vision for the landscape of the campus. And the way that he's proposed a framework is a very flexible, dynamic framework, so that over time these paths could bend, or they could mold in a way to accept larger or smaller buildings, and so that you're not locked into a very inflexible framework over time. So here's where we are today, current phase 1 master plan. And so you can see that a majority of the campus, which is the interim campus, is really held and reserved for research gardens for day 1, terraces, and PV fields that will power that first phase building. That's the net zero building. So this net zero building is currently being designed by Morphosis Architects and developed by Forest City Ratner. The executive education building is still to be determined. The corporate co-location building, which Matthew will speak about momentarily, is being designed by Weissman Freddie and also with Forest City Ratner.
We should say that Cornell is going to own their academic building, whereas Forest City Ratner will own the private corporate
The corporate,
location.
well, absolutely, yes, that's correct. And the residential building is being designed by Handel Architects, and Hudson Related is the developer. And as I mentioned before, we have a token building in this project, which is the central utility plant, which powers all of these buildings in terms of electrical distribution, is being designed by SOM. So this is a picture of the full build of the campus. You take away the full build, and this is the phase 1 campus with interim landscaping for the first portion, and so it gives you an idea of how all the buildings are organized. Again, serviced off of the Loop Road, but then the Tech Plaza becomes the space that becomes the entry, which is at those higher points for each of the buildings. That's it. Any questions?
Okay.
I'm going to talk about how transportation affects smart growth. With the Roosevelt Island project as a case study, it was very important to have all of the transportation aspects come together in the selection of that site. One of the other sites that the city looked at, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I'm sorry it didn't make the cut, it had subways that were too far away. It's in more of an industrial area. It doesn't have a ton of residential nearby. It's just didn't have the synergy with the neighborhood that this would have. And so I'm going to also talk about the special district and what that meant to the parking zoning. And I'm going to talk about the corporate co-location building, the building that Forest City Radnor is building. So the selection of the Roosevelt Island site was key. You have to have, when you want smart growth, you have to have transit there. You know, the F train is just a couple minutes walk from the north end of campus. Meredith talked about the tram. The loop road that goes around the campus is very pedestrian and bike friendly, because the only reason you would go around it is if you were destined there. There's nothing at the bottom of it except for a park that doesn't have a lot of visitors. So having streets around it that are walkable and friendly, very important. And because the streets were built by the state of New York, the master plan looked at widening the streets so that they could accommodate bicycles and better pedestrian paths. So the island of Roosevelt Island itself was part of a redevelopment plan that envisioned just one big parking garage to serve the entire thing. So when it was redeveloped, that was built. It's a 1,900 space parking garage called the Motorgate Garage. And when you drive onto Roosevelt Island from Queens across this rinky-dink bridge, you see a really ugly parking garage, but then you park there and you get out of your car and you don't get back in it. You walk down the main street, there are shops on both sides. You walk down the Esplanade along the river, and you know, it sounds very nice. And it really works. The traffic volumes on Main Street in Roosevelt Island are very low. Part of it is because the streets are partially cobblestone, it's very narrow, but really there's hardly any parking on the island except for at Motorgate. So a lot of people are walking around there. So the reason that the special district, I think, was successful in the smart growth of the Roosevelt Island campus is because they learned from the Motorgate Garage. They realized that if they had a way to keep people from getting in their cars and having a lot of parking available, then there wouldn't be smart growth. There would be a lot of people driving there. So the Southern Roosevelt Island Special District, it capped parking at only 250 spaces for the first phase of development. So we've heard how much square footage, you know, hundreds of thousands of square feet and only 250 spaces. So that's great. Eventually, there'll be over 2 million square feet of development, and the cap is 500 spaces for that. Within that, I think, are 1,400 housing units approximately. So when you're doing parking zoning for smart growth and TOD, you try to get around 1 parking space per unit, but they've gone way below that here. And one of the reasons that they could do that is the way that the Motorgate Garage functions. So the Motorgate Garage is pretty full overnight, but then during the day, a lot of the residents in Roosevelt Island, they leave in their cars, the ones who don't go towards Manhattan on the F train, take the tram, they leave in their cars. So that leaves literally hundreds of empty spaces during the day. So in our traffic studies, we're able to prove to the residents who really didn't believe that you could build almost no parking and get away with it, that people who would choose to drive to Roosevelt Island, even though you have the ability to get there by the subway or the tram, people who chose to drive to Roosevelt Island, they would mainly be able to be accommodated at the Motorgate Garage, which is probably like a 10-15 minute walk up from the campus along Main Street. So that enabled us in the environmental impact statement to show the residents and show that there would not be an impact on parking in the first phase if we built no parking. that's the great thing about the special district, is it allows in the first phase for 0 parking to be built, as much as 250 spaces. But all of that parking that they would need is available at the Motorgate Garage right now. In the final phases of development, where they could have as many as 500 spaces on campus, our study showed that you didn't need to build that many if you didn't want to. So we showed just a very small overnight impact if you built no parking with all of that development, because the travel demand forecasting was showing with the availability of seats on the F train and the proximity to Manhattan, and because of the synergy between these buildings, you have 1,400 units of housing for corporate co-location clients and for graduate students. You have a hotel there in the full build-out, and you have these academic spaces. Well, they all live together, so there's not a reason to have a lot of people driving there, because you could live there. If you can't live there, then you can take the F train. So there was just not a real demand for a lot of parking. So it really matters where your site selection is, if you're going to have smart growth or not. If you have mixed use development where you minimize the number of vehicle trips to different land uses there, and if you can be near transit, that's very important. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is the amount of parking that Forest City Radnor Corporation is going to be building. They're building a 100,000, over 100,000 square foot office building essentially. And they saw that the types of tenants that they're going to be attracting, these tech startup tenants, those kinds of people, they really don't drive a car, They laugh at people that drive cars, right? So we were asked what we thought, because we had done the parking studies for the EIS, what we thought about maybe even less of a demand for parking. And we talked to them and said, would you let us interview some tech startup firms so that we can have some data? And they had to think about it, because other people have not asked them to kind of be non-secretive and to share information. So we were able to convince them that that was the way to go, that by having a data-driven approach to questioning the demand in the EIS, which is a tricky thing because we did it, we didn't want to shoot ourselves in the foot there. We were able to go out and we looked at about a dozen tech startup firms that were located in Dumbo and downtown Brooklyn and Long Island City. And it turns out that the people that work there, they really don't drive. We have the data to prove it. So as we conducted those interviews and presented that information to Forest City Radnor and Cornell, they really felt strongly about being able to build just minimal parking for that corporate co-location building. So if you were to prorate the amount of parking that was demanded in the environmental impact statement for that building to the size that it is now, it's a little bigger now, about 70 spaces would be demanded by people driving there. But then our survey showed that about half of that is what's realistically demanded by tech startup firms. So we have given recommendations to them, and they're discussing the ultimate number of parking spaces they can build. But so just to summarize, when you're doing a smart growth development or a TOD development, location, very important. You have to be very careful about the parking, and then also the shared parking that you have between the land uses. And then you have to have a brave developer who wants to go out and build less parking than they've built somewhere else. But if you're attracting younger crowd of talent, you have to realize that those people, they ride bikes, they walk, they use Uber, then they're just not owning a vehicle. So there's just not a huge reason to expect that in an office building of 100,000 square feet that lots and lots of people are going to drive and park there. They'll be attracted anyway. So that's what I wanted to say about transportation on Roosevelt Island.
Can I just build on that, which is really interesting, because I was working on a project this summer at the University of Nevada at Reno, which you would consider Reno is actually it's not a city known for its mass transit. And the leadership of the University of Nevada, Reno, and Reno has an emerging tech corridor with a lot of refugees from the Bay Area, told us our kids don't drive. They use rideshare, they're like, the percentage of car ownership on campus has plummeted. So this is really a new trend that you're seeing in urban areas, even in Reno, because you would expect that in New York City. But this is really an emerging trend.
Well, let's stay on this topic of cars, because as much as we like Brooklyn and Jersey City and Manhattan, Roosevelt Island, Long Island doesn't have the transportation network as much as Steve Malone wants to build it. We just don't have it. So how have your projects got people out of their cars and to enjoy what we want is walkable Manhattan? Matt, how do you get people out of the cars?
Well, I know the trend is that you don't have to get young people out of their cars. They're not in their cars in the first place. So even the young people who move back to Long Island or where I live in Westchester County, even without a robust transit network, they're still not owning cars. They're getting rides, they're finding ways to carpool or to do ride share, and for the odd trip to the store, they have Zipcar accounts. I mean, they have bikes. There's so many ways that young people act that are just sort of contrary to the way that I think. Like, I just have to own a car, and if I have to pick something up at the store, I'm going to drive there and get it. I just don't think of any other ways. But if you have been raised and went off to college and then come back home to not have a car at all, then you're just going to keep acting that way. So we kind of overbuild the roads because we always have, but we need to look at the trend of lower vehicle ownership as a way to make sure that we don't overdo it and that we don't overpark these developments too.
I think it's chicken and eggy too, in the sense that I think a lot of young, talented, tech workers, knowledge workers are choosing to live in places where they can live a car-free lifestyle very easily. And so when you think about like transit-oriented development on Long Island, when you think about this kinds of cities where kids from like the top universities are flocking to when they graduate. I mean, they're places where people can live without a car.
Yeah, from a developer's perspective, we're out there relying on institutional capital to finance these projects, and one of the metrics that we look at is for site selection and evaluating the potential for development is walk score. And if you don't know what that is, it's a website, and you type in your address and it'll give you a walk score rating from 1 to 100, I think. And that data goes automatically into a little model that we use, and it's one factor that churns out sort of data or a score for a site, if you will, that we're evaluating. So I think when you talk about smart growth and site selection and locations, the money out there investing in these projects is demanding that those projects be located in those types of locations.
Well, can you compare like your project in Jersey City to the one you're building in Garden City?
No, we're not building in Garden City. Mineola.
Mineola.
Yeah.
Do you have a parking garage in Jersey City?
There will be parking. We're parked to about just over 1/2 of a 0.5 ratio in Jersey City. In Mineola, we're parked, I think, 1.4-ish, and 1.5. And so I think we're gonna, in Mineola, I think, if it's a young couple, and I don't think that young couple these days has 2 cars. I think they probably have 1 car. Someone's probably commuting in the city, and the other's probably commuting, regionally within Nassau County. So I don't anticipate that we will fill up that parking garage, but we're required to build that for zoning.
In order to have a walkable downtown, and knowing Long Island's transportation system, you need a parking garage, right? I mean, you guys tell me.
Yes, I think if you were to build a new project in Long Island today, you have to provide parking, but the question is how much. I don't think you wouldn't get your project financed without parking. Yes, people take the train, and they like options, I think, you know, these days probably more and more people are also riding bikes, or like to, it's safe. So there's a lot of different modes to consider these days, but I think no matter what, you're still gonna have to provide parking. There's no getting around it.
Yeah, I think it's also about the perception of people's behaviors, and kind of preempting that a little bit and following that a bit. So, yeah, you might need a parking garage, but let's not make that the central figure of the town, you know what I mean? It's the same way in architecture. If you walk through a set of front doors when you enter the building and the elevator is there, you're gonna take the elevator. But if you walk in the doors and you see an open stair or something that's inviting, you're gonna take the stair. And so I think it's, you know, from a city planning point of view, I think, you know, even though you might have that central parking garage, it might not be the front door, it might not be the first thing that you see, but you should also explore, you know, what are the other options, what are the other choices, paths of choice that people can take, whether it's, you know, paths that are bicycle friendly or wider walkways that are inviting for pedestrians, so that you, even though you may take a car, okay, that's a one stop, but then what are the other options that you have to be interconnected within a, you know, say a 5-minute walk?
Ron, to stop the brain drain, do we need, like, to get people out of the cars?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about that since the very first New Urbanist presentations that were brought to Long Island in '97, '98, and they were looking at the shopping centers and saying, we have a real problem here. And because we know if we redevelop everything the way really we need to, just adding these 10,000 new housing units, if we continue to develop the way we have in terms of our use of transportation, we're going to have more traffic congestion. Quality of life is going to deteriorate, and you end up trying to chase your own tail. But what Steve said was so, it put a smile on my face, because if in fact the younger people today that are coming out of maybe not even the great colleges, but maybe the regular colleges, are coming out with a sense, or particularly colleges that are in cities or in some downtowns where they got the idea of walkability. You know, they're coming out with perhaps a different set of expectations, and we keep thinking of how we're building Long Island for us. But I think I'm getting hope that the younger generation offers us an opportunity. Now, but we can't just be laissez-faire about it. I believe we have to seize the opportunities, and I think that is why the level of proaction that we take now is very important. I think we have to start making mass transportation sexy. I think we have to do it. I think we have to market it, just like we have to market the viability of housing. I think we have to push through this huge resistance and the habits of those of us who are 60 and over, and all the NIMBYism, and I think allow the younger people's perspective of transportation to take hold. And then suddenly bus or light rail suddenly becomes more feasible, or Uber or some other form, evolution of transit, as well as the fact that these kids hopefully will be living in transit centers or down above shops and downtowns, so they won't need to use as much automobile.
Well, one of the recurring things that I cover on Long Island is the tension between single-family homes and the homeowners, and this idea of stopping the brain drain by having walkable downtown and multiple family homes. Jamie, I'm sure you've seen this, and I'm wondering if you guys have also seen did you guys have any tension between single, not on North Carolina?
The problem is that New York City is kind of a sui generis, right? Like, New York City is not really a model for anywhere else in the country, because nowhere else in the country is like New York City. So I think we have to kind of, put that right off the bat, but I know that tension exists in other places, particularly in suburban places, so.
And have you ever seen a resolution, and have you ever found a resolution?
A resolution
To sort of make Long Island appealing to future generations who want walkable areas and multi-family housing, with people who are already here who like.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that we're finding that a lot of folks on Long Island who own single-family homes want to get out of them and move to sort of apartment communities where there's no sort of, first of all, no huge property tax, no maintenance, very convenient lifestyle. So I think that there's people who in the single family homes who are dying to get out but want to stay in the community and just need other options for living. And we've been surprised by the amount of folks who are native Long Islanders who are not sort of young professionals who are choosing that apartment lifestyle. So I think that there is, yes, there's a lot of resistance to it, but I do believe that there's another part of the population that sees great advantage to sort of apartment living.
You guys had a totally different kind of opposition, right?
But I just wanted to build on that one thing. I think Long Island shouldn't be so hard on itself in the sense that you guys have a leg up compared to 99.9% of the rest of the country, in the sense that you have a very good transportation network that enables you to build transit-oriented development. And one area where we've worked that I think might be interesting to look at, and you might know it, Jamie, is the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, which as a built environment is kind of ugly, and has made a radical cultural change, I think, in the last 25 years from what, the metro system is hardly as extensive as Long Island Railroad, and yet it's one of the best public transit systems in the country. And you're seeing multi-family unit developments around every metro station in suburban Virginia. And the Washington Post actually just had a big article about how people are choosing, young people want to live in the apartments versus single family homes for all the reasons that Jamie just said. I mean, they don't want, I think it's with like car ownership too, they don't want the responsibility of maintaining, of taxes. They also were, saw how many people were burned by home ownership in the crisis, and it's like renting at that age in a dense, suburban yet transit-oriented environment where you can walk places and then get on the metro and go into downtown DC if you want, just like you can get on the LIRR and go into the city, has a lot of appeal. So I think Northern Virginia is a good model.
I do too, and WMATA has done a great job. Well, one of the interesting things is that you see this, the planning is happening with newer transportation networks where they're not older, they're not big, it's sort of, it's easy to put a light rail through cornfields and then zone around those stations. It's a lot harder to do that in established downtowns where the property ownership is fractured and there's not large sites near transit access anyway. So I think the example given about Northern Virginia is spot on. Not only has this sort of the young professionals seen their parents get burned by home ownership, but there's also been a lot of tumultuous times in the economy that's, I think young people really want flexibility in location and being, the flexibility to just walk away from a lease after a year and move to, Denver for a new opportunity, that kind of thing. So I think that there's a lot of appeal in renting in that sense.
It sounds like I'm underselling Long Island's transit network. Maybe you can compare it to the one in Northern Virginia that you're talking about?
Well, the Long Island Railroad is the busiest passenger railroad in the country. Northern Virginia, if you guys know the DC metro system, it's a hybrid where it's a commuter rail like Long Island Rail when it goes. It's not as extensive as Long Island Railroad, but when it goes out into the suburbs of DC, and when it comes into DC, it operates like a subway. So it would be as if the New York City subway system had lines that came out to Nassau and Suffolk County and then operated very differently when they got out here. And it's a regional network, so you can get on it and. But out in the suburbs, it's not as dense in terms of, there's not as many stops. So it's still kind of car-oriented or difficult to walk, too far. But what they've created are these hubs around every metro station in areas that were completely car-oriented just 20 years ago.
So that's our main asset is the LIR.
Yeah, it is. And what's interesting, DC has been ahead in terms of land use planning, Columbia County. We have often looked to Washington DC area as a model for many of these things. But one of the things that DC, that the DC, Maryland, Virginia planning concept has with it is a considerable, they get the density thing, you see? So if you go to Bethesda, you go to some of those stations even going further out off the the central part of DC, you still have fairly high levels of density that have been accepted by the community. And what's happened is that it really works. And one of the places we're losing our best and brightest people to is DC, because there is such a vibrant active transit system and a vibrant active community on almost all the major stops along these rails. And Long Island has kind of got to get through this growing phase, and we talked about Garden City. Oh my God, trying to, I giggle, but you know the thing is we have to get through this impasse that density is awful and terrible and all that stuff, because that's what's killing us. That single-handedly is making it so much more difficult for economic viability here.
How did you guys deal with the opposition in Roosevelt Island?
A lot of meetings. The Cornell tech people wanted to be excellent neighbors, and they honestly have pretty deep pockets to be able to have as many meetings and to be able to dip into their funds to be able to do things to help be good neighbors. Like Steve said, they did the environmental impact statement assuming that 100% of the construction would be done by trucks, because that's the reasonable worst case scenario, and you have to say these are the impacts that could happen. But in reviewing that statement with the public, they began committing to barging some, and then now they're barging 20% of
25.
Well, yeah. So what they've done has been great listeners, and they know they're going to be there for 99 years, and that the residents in Roosevelt Island are going to be, working on their campus. There's going to be a synergy between the downtown Roosevelt Island Main Street and the campus, so you have to start out on the right foot. So they had a lot of meetings, and they came to a consensus on a lot of the issues. So that's how it worked from a transportation point of view.
The opposition wasn't, it wasn't fierce. This was something that, who would be opposed to, an Ivy League technology campus on the site of a hospital that, was going to close anyway. I think the concerns were the construction, as Matt said, and also remember Cornell is a well-endowed institution that could afford to reach into its pockets and do things like barging and searching for murals that maybe somebody else would not do. But it was also managing expectations. Of course, community, they see Cornell as kind of a money bags institution, and people were like, well, can you build us tennis courts, or can you build us a new ferry terminal? And Cornell had to manage expectations of what it was willing to do and what it wasn't willing to do.
Well, I think it was really less opposition and it was more cooperation, because ultimately, at the very tip of that island, that's the FDR Memorial. And a lot of conversations with the REOC Community Board throughout the process have been, okay, how are you going to keep the end of the island open for us through the construction of this campus? And so there was a very sophisticated and articulated demolition plan. How are we going to contain the construction limits so that we can maintain access for the community to the esplanade in a very safe way? Also, the development of a tree protection plan with the community. So coming back, how are we going to preserve some of the older trees throughout the process of demolition, and how are we going to preserve the roots around, the root structure around those trees? And it was constantly coming back to the community board, not only listening, but being responsive and responsible. And also the experience of our CUP building, the central utility plant, for example, really listening to the community to say, what's the materiality of that facade going to be? How is it going to feel if I'm walking next to that building, being a utility building rather than an inhabited building? And so we were taking input that we received from the community board, feeding that into our design, and then taking that to the Public Design Commission in order to get approval. So it very much was a cooperation.
How percentage-wise, how much of your project was done or finalized before you had community meetings? How
Nothing was finalized.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is like how, by percentage, like how much did the community influence the final?
We took specific input from the community to the Public Design Commission, which influenced the ultimate design approval that we had for our building. And from even the materiality of the
Well,
facade.
I would say, I mean, we hired, so when Cornell decided they were gonna go after this project, you know, and we were their consultant, you know, we hired SOM, that was one of the first things we did to develop a master plan that was gonna be part of the submittal. So I think that there were some principles and concepts that were thought about that formed the foundation for the campus that were part of our submittal to the city. But, you know, as Meredith said, you know, that's not